Hello everyone, I'm Hannada Yoshepin Silitonga and I'm a student at Erlangga University. Today I would like to present you about the journal that titled Inflation and Global Supply Chain Pressure in Eurozone, a time-varying causal analysis. The topic is about the impact of global supply chain pressure on inflation in the Eurozone and how this relationship unfolds over time. Inflation has been a central concern for policymakers, and the role supply chain disruptions in driving inflation has gained attention. In the past few years, global supply chains have experienced significant disruptions due to various factors such as the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical tension, labor shortage, and increased transportation costs. Disruptions haven't only affected the flow of goods and service, but have also had for had also had far-reaching effects on macroeconomic indicators, particularly inflation. Traditionally, inflation is viewed through the lens of demand-side dynamics, such as consumer spending or monetary expansion. However, supply-side factors like raw material shortage, delayed shipments, and rising logistic costs have become increasingly important in shaping price levels. Prior studies link supply-side factors to inflation, but often assume a static relationship. The GSCPI has been introduced by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to measure disruptions, and existing research mainly focuses on demand-driven inflation, whereas the study highlights supply-side shocks. So, this journal seeks to address this issue by analyzing the causal relationship between inflation and global supply chain pressures. This journal using three methods. The first is research design. For the research design, this journal using one bootstrap full sample gender causality test. The study finds that the relationship between inflation in the Eurozone and global supply chain pressure isn't permanent, but rather only exists during certain periods such as of time crisis. Two is parameter stability. The study highlights that full sample causality tests may become inaccurate when there are structural changes in the data, as they assume that model parameters remain constant over time. To address this, the study performs parameter stability tests using methods like SUBRF, MINF, and the acid test. That tests help detect short-term instabilities in the relationship between variables. Three is subsample rolling window causality estimation. This study uses the rolling window bootstrap method to analyze the causal relationship between GSCPI and IIEZ. This method allows the analysis to be conducted with gradually shifting subsamples, enabling it to capture dynamic changes in the causal relationship over time. The second is material. This study utilizes various data sources to analyze the relationship between global supply chain pressure and inflation. One is GSCPI. GSCPI is collected from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and this index measures global supply chain disruptions. Two is macroeconomic indicators. This includes exchange rates, industrial production, and other relevant factors covering inflation. Third is procedure. The research follows a structured approach in data collection and analysis, consisting of the following steps. One is apply the TVP-FIR model. This model is used to analyze the dynamic relationship between GSCP and inflation over time. Two is conduct a time-varying gender causality test. This test determines whether changes in GSCP influence inflation in different periods. Three is comparison across different time periods. The findings are examined over various economic phases, like pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic to identify temporal variation in causality. Okay, I found explicit data and implicit data about this journal. For the explicit one, one is monthly GSCPI index. This is obtained from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and this index measures global supply chains measured on a monthly basis. Two is Eurozone CPI. The CPI data is used to track inflation trends in the Eurozone. And three is other economic variables. The first one is industrial production. It represents economic output and productivity. The second is exchange rates. It tracks currency fluctuation affecting inflation and trade. The third is oil prices. It's a key factor influencing transportation costs and inflationary prices. And for implicit one is the role of external shocks. The study considers the impact of major global disruptions such as COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine war, which have contributed to supply chain disruption and inflation spikes. Two is influence of monetary and fiscal policy. Examines how central banks policies like interest rates and money supplies and government fiscal measures help moderate inflationary effects caused by supply side shocks. So we have uh, four things that find. The first is the impact of GSCP was strongest in time of crisis. The journal finds that the influence of GSCP on inflation in the Eurozone is the most significant during periods of the major crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic or geopolitical conflicts like Russia and Ukraine war. During this time, disruptions in production, distribution, and global logistics become severe, leading to supply shortage and higher production costs. As a result, prices rise substantially and driving inflation upward. In this condition, the SCP become a dominant factor influencing inflation and highlighting its critical role when the global economic system is under stress. Two is before the pandemic, GSCP had a weaker impact on inflation. In the pre-pandemic period, although GSCP still had effect on inflation, its influence was relatively weak. This was due to the stability and efficiency of global supply chains during normal times, where minor disruptions had limited effect on overall prices. Inflation during the phase was more commonly driven by demand side factors such as consumer spending and monetary policy. Hence, GLCP played only a minor in shaping inflation and stable economic conditions. Three is before and after the pandemic, GLCP showed a positive causal relationship with inflation. Despite the variation in intensity, the study rev- reveals a consistently positive causal relationship between GSCP and inflation in the Eurozone both before and after the pandemic. This means that increases in the global supply chain pressure index tend to lead to higher inflation rates, regardless of the economic environment. It's a guess that supply chain pressure have a persistent influence on inflation, and even in non periods they contributed to price increases and though perhaps to a lesser degree. Or is there is a more variation in the causal link between the SCPI and inflation in the Eurozone. Key insight from the study is that the relationship between GSCPI and inflation is not static but evolves over time. This time-varying causal relationship indicates that the strength and at times direction at times the direction of the effects depending on the broader economic context. For example, the causal link may strengthen during global disruption and weaken as supply chains recover. Recognizing this temporal variation is crucial for policymakers as it underscores the need for adaptive policy responses depending on the specific economic conditions at a given time. So we have three things to discuss. The first is about the rising importance of supply chain factors in inflation. The COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, the global energy crisis, and the geopolitical tension have demonstrated how disruptions in production, logistics, and distribution can drive inflation just as much, if not more, than consumer behavior. For instance, shortage in semiconductors have impacted everything from cars to electronics, while port congestion and shipping delays have increased transportation costs, all feeding into rising prices both procedures and consumers. As a result, the GICPI had become an increasingly valuable tool. But fluctuations in this index reflect the stress point in global supply system. The authors of the study argue that these fluctuations should no longer be treated as external shocks, but rather as core components of inflation forecasting models. By integrating supply chain pressure into predictive models, analysts and policymakers can develop a more accurate and holistic view of inflationary trends. The second is the need for a time varying approach. Another major find from the study is the dynamic nature of the relationship between supply chain pressure and inflation. Traditional models often assume a static or constant relationship over time, essentially implying that the effect of supply chain issues on inflation remains the same regardless of the economic context. However, the study challenges this view by employing a time-varying parameter or autoregressive model, which allows the analysis to adjust over time. This approach captures how the causal impact of supply chain pressure on inflation evolves during different periods, such as before, during, and after economic shocks. The third is about the policy implication. From a policy perspective, the study presents several crucial implications. One of the most important is the need of central banks to broaden their approach to inflation control. Historically, the primary tool for fighting inflation has been interest rate adjustment, a demand-side intervention. But if inflation is being driven by supply chain disruptions, raising interest rates may not be effective and could even have unintended negative consequences. Therefore, policymakers need to recognize and respond to supply side inflation risks. This includes adopting strategies that go beyond monetary policy. One is diversifying supply chains to reduce dependency on a few global sources. Two is encouraging domestic production and investing in local manufacturing capabilities, especially for critical goods. Three is building strategic reserve and improving logistic infrastructure to make supply chains more resilient. Four is strengthening international cooperation to reduce trade bottlenecks and promote transparency in supply chain data. So, so for the last of our presentation, I have the conclusion of my presentation. The first is the impact was strongest the time crisis indicate inflation isn't just demand driven but also affected supply side constraints such as consumer spending or monetary policy. It's also significant influence by supply side contains disruption in production, logistics, and international trade and directly increase prices by limiting the availability of goods and raising input costs. Two is no connection between the two variables during the global financial crisis. This suggests that not all economic downturns cause supply chain driven inflation. In that particular crisis, financial market instability and constraints were the dominant forces, while global trade and supply system remained relatively functional. During the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, the result indicated a positive causation between GSCP and inflation. And the last is there is a temporary variation in the causal link between GSCP and IIEZ. I think that's all of my presentation today. So for the conclusion, we have four things to know about the journal. So that's all from me. Thank you so much.